Hi. Right. Firstly, Whitney, hi. Good to see you again. We only recorded recently, and feels like the entire internet listened to that episode. So thank you for that.
Yeah, no problem.
We're at like 1.2 million views on YouTube. I think my previous biggest show was like 250,000. So that was kind of insane. But lots of mixed and but mainly good feedback. So thanks for doing that. Mark, good to see you. It's been a little while. How are you?
Man. Good to see you too. Great. Yeah. I think it was like August 22 or something like that. So obviously we've seen each other around, but it's great to be back and great to be joined with Whitney, of course.
Yeah. I don't know how this came about because I like you obviously both independently. I didn't even know you were working on something together. Big fan of you as well, Mark. You know, we became friends a couple of years ago. How did this all come about, you two working together? Because it's not something I would have seen.
Yeah, for sure. when I was, doing the editorial for the print magazine, we put together right away, like day one, put together a list of, journalists and people that we would, dream list of people we would want to work with and have write for us. And I'm pretty certain Whitney was kind of the first one on that list, been a fan of her work for a really long time. A few years of pretty much reading everything, the books and every article that comes out and whatever. And so we reached out and she did some work for the magazine. And then, we met at, in person at the Miami conference and, had a lot to talk about. And we were like, hey, we should probably do some work together, at least do like a podcast and see how it goes. And we have a lot of similar things and, a lot of things in common in terms of how we look at the world and Bitcoin and, a lot of things. So yeah, just started kind of pen paling and we've now written 2 pieces together and much more to come for sure.
Amazing. Well, we're going to talk specifically today about the piece you've written with regards to BlackRock, which is fascinating. And I was certainly initially a little bit sucked in by Larry Fink and his Bitcoin is Hope, but guarded, and then heard him discussing tokenizing the world, which is bullshit. I think we dropped a few years ago. It seems to be making a resurgence. So it's very interesting getting into this because I'm not sure BlackRock is our new friend that people keep thinking they are. What was the background to doing this, Mark?
Yeah. So being editor-in-chief of Bitcoin Magazine, you kind of have to, everyone likes to think that, it's a very, we're just outputting our opinion exactly, and editorial just sort of marches to some financial incentive or something, but really, I look at this role very, I have a responsibility to show, the varying opinions and lots of different things that appear in Bitcoin. One of them of which being, of course, ETFs and this pro ETF thing. And so Bitcoin Magazine was doing a lot of ETF coverage because it's a really popular thing. People are really interested in this. And it is, of course, a state change, as to how the U.S. regulatory system looks at Bitcoin. And now we're seeing these huge institutional players. There was a lot to talk about. But I got really concerned really quickly at the way that people were just kind of not thinking at all adversarially about the ETF and people like Larry Fink and BlackRock coming into the Bitcoin space and being basically welcomed with an orange carpet. Just come on in, man. Like, let's go, Larry. Come on, Lawrence. And I thought people kind of needed to be reminded of exactly who this guy is and how he got his start and what his plan is and and how quickly these things change, right? Like he was kind of an enemy of Bitcoiners very recently, talking about ESG and carbon credits and all this stuff. And all of a sudden that's just completely forgotten. And so, really wanted to kind of just see the things that he had done in the very recent past, talk about how he kind of came up, in First Boston and creating the first CMO and his taking advantage of the 2008 crisis and all of this up until the modern day. And then, of course, literally in his discussions about the ETF, saying these quiet parts out loud about how Bitcoin is a technology for asset storage and how it's an asset, not a currency, and how if we can tokenize an ETF of Bitcoin, what else can we ETF? And there was just a lot of things that he said right away that no one I really, really thought caught. And so, yeah, we wanted to kind of make sure we did a really nice retrospective of Lawrence and BlackRock, and kind of point out these things that, he's really clearly saying that this is their plan for kind of how they want to use Bitcoin. So that was really where it came from. And then, we just sent a bunch of emails back and forth, probably sent, I don't know, 9 to 12 drafts back and forth, and just kind of built up, this piece. Whitney had done a bunch of research on kind of green finance and natural asset corporations and a lot of stuff before. So kind of combined a lot of that. But really, it came out of a need of seeing this kind of lack of pushback from the Bitcoin community with all of these big institutions coming in.
What do you generally think of ETFs, Mark? You reluctantly accepting, pro, again, because it feels like we can't stop them, and there is this, a solid argument for it kind of gives some kind of regulatory cover. It's like a regulatory blessing, but at the same time, do you need or want a regulatory blessing? Can this ultimately be co-opted? You can look at it in multiple different directions.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely a signpost that, like, okay, Bitcoin is officially being embraced by the U.S. regulatory system, the U.S. financial system. This is definitely, maybe no longer is this really a counterculture or a sort of a revolutionary counter financial system when it's being very embraced by the biggest players. Specifically, right? BlackRock, JP Morgan, Jane Street Capital. These are the participants within the iShares IBIT product. It's I think we should be concerned, at least as to where it could go. And I think that's a lot of what we kind of outlined in the piece. I wrote the Bitcoin dollar book that came out last year. That's sort of an alternative narrative to, the Bitcoin number go up, I think, narrative that's prevalent in the space is sort of like hey, maybe actually Bitcoin is a helpful tool for the dollar system. Perhaps this is going to be used by the dollar system as a mechanism to basically a demand inelastic commodity where we can, and I say we, obviously, Americans, but I have nothing to do with it, obviously, but can inflate into this demand inelastic asset that's priced in dollars, basically recreate this petrodollar system where we have monopolized the ins and outs to be dollar denominated tokens or just literal dollars. So you're creating a mechanism where people have to buy dollars or have to sell Bitcoin for dollars to really be able to appreciate any of the liquidity in the Bitcoin space. So, perhaps there is this counter narrative where the dollar system is helped by Bitcoin. And then I think when we see the ETF embrace by the SEC, approving these 11 spot ETFs on January 11th, including BlackRock and, Fidelity and Franklin Templeton and some of these really big asset managers. And then you look at who's holding and helping, the authorized participants that are helping with these ETFs, like JP Morgan Chase. You're seeing the biggest players in the U.S. financial system and the U.S. dollar system, which really is, a private kind of public blurring. It really is a private capital creation system. And these are the banks and these are the asset managers that really control the dollar system. And here they are embracing Bitcoin in a huge way. And not only that, they're bringing, 200,000 plus Bitcoin. If you're not counting GBTC, which is already almost half a million Bitcoin, they're bringing in 200,000 Bitcoin, back to being onshored and within the border and within the regulatory arm of the United States. So all that to be said, yes, it is something I think in there's a 3%, celebration of like, wow, look how far we've come. This is crazy. We've really been embraced by the institutional system. And then like 97% of like, well, we've been embraced by this system that's really done a lot of damage, right? I mean, these are people that really did criminal activity, in 2008 and took huge advantage of these mortgage obligations that exploded, these debt obligations that exploded, and really hurt a lot of people, the working class, in a really, really serious way. And now these are the people embracing Bitcoin as if it's this kind of anti-state, anti-government, unseizable asset. And it's like, okay, well, I think we should pause and, remember who these people are, and take a look, at what's really going on. So that's kind of how I look at it. It's definitely a two-edged sword.
And Whitney, I'm going to assume, based on your previous work, BlackRock and Larry Fink have been in your crosshairs before, and likely an institution you don't trust at all.
Yeah. Well, my policy tends to be don't trust Wall Street giants, because they become that powerful on Wall Street because they, are pretty cutthroat and criminal, because that's how you rise to the top of that particular sphere. So the first time I really wrote meaningfully about Larry Fink was probably a few years ago. In relations to the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, where Larry Fink is a principal. It's like a UN sponsored organization that was co-founded by Mark Carney, former head of the Bank of England and later Bank of Canada, former Goldman Sachs. And also Mike Bloomberg is a big figure there, the former mayor of New York and a well-known billionaire who, started off at Salomon Brothers. So these are essentially bankers, developing what amounts to a major component of UN-sponsored policy directly related to their climate change policies. And basically what GFANZ proposes is creating a new financial governance system, seizing what they call the new Bretton Woods moment. Basically, recreating the global financial system and also reimagining the multilateral development banks, like the World Bank, the IMF, et cetera, which came out of actual Bretton Woods, right? So they want to move all of that into a new paradigm. Larry Fink's been particularly vocal about that. And what GFANZ proposes specifically is merging the members of GFANZ with the multilateral development banks as a way to basically use the same debt slavery model that the MDBs have been criticized for using, but instead of using it to further U.S. empire or the dollar and things of that nature, it's instead the proposal is to use it to create better enabling environments in countries for the green investments of these large financial institutions and asset managers. So it's basically like perpetuating the same model of the MDBs, but having basically Wall Street run it under the guise that it's a planetary necessity. And that we can't get to net zero without this, which frankly, if you look into the explanations for that, there's no way that's the case. But that's, how I first started writing about Larry Fink was because of his involvement in this relatively open plan to create a new financial system, which among other things doesn't just rest on the MDBs, but also on the development of global carbon markets, which comes up in this particular piece in a pretty meaningful way.
When you look at this, Whitney, do you consider this as BlackRock using their power to rent seek off government policy? Or do you think these people are just purely evil thieves? Or is it both?
Well, Larry Fink is someone who's obviously a member of the elite, and he's also a person who throughout his entire career has been pretty obsessed with risk management. So I think, whatever this new financial system is, it's that he is, part of this group that's proposing this, ultimately is about trying to enable BlackRock to continue its massive expansion to own, essentially everything with, as little risk to them as possible, which obviously a lot of the stuff that Fink is pushing for is part of this broader a system that the world's being pushed into under the guise of sustainable development that includes things like digital IDs and carbon markets and all of that, setting something up where it's will be very difficult to challenge BlackRock's financial prominence and dominance, really, and anything that Fink and others would view as a risk to, their current trajectory, I guess. They don't really have to worry about people or movements like that as they enter into and sort of impose upon us these new systems, which includes, some of these forms of digital control, like the CBDC and their private sector equivalents, for example, programmable surveillable money, and, tied into the digital ID thing. All of this, as is noted in the article, is meant to interface with global carbon markets and the multilateral development banks that Fink has been targeting in particular through GFANs and also, BlackRock itself has been pretty focused on them. They're seeking to, the World Bank is developing climate wallet functionality and a lot of this other infrastructure on which global carbon markets would rely, and are also attempting to become the main data storage for the digital ID system as well. So a lot of big moves are being made through these institutions for part of this new global financial governance system, as GFANS calls it.
But therefore, Whitney, did you raise your eyes recently when Elon Musk raised the idea of a carbon tax system? We spoke about him in our previous interview.
Yeah, I wasn't really surprised because it's a position that Elon Musk has had for some time. That particular tweet you're referring to that was relatively recent is not the first time that he's sort of openly or publicly endorsed the idea of either a carbon tax or carbon markets. He's also endorsed a lot of other things that are supported more broadly by groups like the World Economic Forum, like UBI, for example, and some other policies as well. And, a lot of the success of Tesla, for example, has been related to sort of this ESG push in some ways, and in terms of the idea that we need to replace all fossil fuel consuming vehicles with electric vehicles. And Tesla is obviously the market leader in that, at least in the United States. So he definitely seems to be aligned in significant ways with some of these policies. So I'm not particularly surprised. I mean, in terms of his what he says, his rhetoric, he's a lot more, he's very openly anti-woke, quote unquote. But a lot of his policies that he's like promoted are a lot more in line with the woke crowd, the globalist people, and all of that. Even if I think it's more of his opposition is found in sort of the culture war space, not so much on actual policy or economic policy in particular.
Well, the woke there is a woke and there is an anti-woke crowd, and I feel like both of them are just different wings of the same establishment ideas. I find the people who try and navigate between those spaces are a lot more interesting. Mark, you were going to speak then.
Well, there's definitely on what you just hit there. I think Whitney and I both definitely agree on that there's sort of basically kind of like a phase shift in this sort of the dialectic of, basically championing, folks like Musk and like Milei, as kind of these like freedom focused, free speech, ANCAP, libertarian kind of, entities. But then you actually look at the things that they're saying and their policies, and it's like, oh, they're actually incredibly aligned with, like a Davos kind of a WEF, programming, right? It's like these, there's kind of there's a useful, emergence of kind of this anti-state, culture that's come up, I think, post kind of lockdowns and in this kind of post-COVID world, where I think a lot of people are, very excited about kind of this slightly right-wing leaning ANCAP sort of entity. And that's it's very useful, I think, for folks like a Fink to basically manufacture consent for this push towards this digital, new financial system. And I think it's really interesting. There's a lot to unpack there, and we can talk a lot about that more. But I think what I wanted to kind of bring up earlier with Fink specifically is that, he's been doing this basically this tokenization or paperization, this ETF kind of idea before any of those things existed. I mean, he was doing this 50 years ago when he first started at First Boston in 76. He was the first Freddie Mac bond trader. He was like kind of starting the mortgage market. It was a really, really like tiny thing. It was a very niche market in the mid 70s. And then by the early 80s, he was the first trader, to put a computer on the trading desk in like 82, 83. And he actually created the first CMO, the collateralized mortgage obligation, which is basically, the first way to basically break up cash flow of mortgages and repackage them and sell them, and using, computers basically to actualize this, this mechanism. So he was doing this, basically 50 years ago, 40 years ago, depending on when you want to say he started. And now he's really grown into being this, his kind of his baby, other than basically creating this debt market, this mortgage market, was bringing computers into the onto the trading floor and basically creating this entire digitalized trading market and risk management. And of course, now there's the huge Aladdin computing system that upholds, I think it's like above $50 trillion of assets are basically, using the Aladdin system for risk management. And this is a system that they've been building for an exceptionally long time. So you start to look at all these things that are happening now, like digital IDs and tokenization and fractionalization and, all these things that we're sort of getting at in this piece and that you're beginning to see people talk about in a real way. Fink was doing this, well before BlackRock even started. And then, of course, with BlackRock, they take advantage of this, basically the market that he helped create when he created the first CMO in 1983. Then we have the CDO, which is basically just a modernized version of that, collateral debt obligations. And that explodes, in a huge way at the end of 07 and 08 and 09. And we actually see BlackRock enter, they were really a bond and fund, company. And now they pivot entirely into being an ETF company, purchasing the iShares brand from Barclays. That actually happened because Barclays didn't want to take a government bailout in 09 from the UK. And so BlackRock comes in, scoops it up for a few billion. And then a year later, there's trillions of dollars in their ETFs and this iShares brand. Now they're the biggest ETF issuer in the world. So Fink creates a market. The market explodes and blows up in 07 and 08. And then he takes advantage of the explosion that happens in that financial crisis to buy up basically the new inflows of what the American market really begins to trade, which is of course ETFs, which now are the dominant kind of vehicle for speculation. So he blows up the bubble, pops the bubble, takes advantage of the bubble popping, buys up this iShares brand that is actually the brand that is now running this Bitcoin ETF, and all of that comes from things that he basically started 50 years ago. So this is a really long time coming of Fink, bringing the computer onto the trading desk, cutting up these cash flows and mortgages, and now moving into the ETF space. And he straight up says it, like ETFs are going to basically be the future of everything. We're going to ETF everything, and we're going to use Bitcoin to basically create some sort of data storage and have this universal ledger that we trade and settle all of these tokenized, trade funds on, these ETFs. So, he's been working on this for an exceptionally long time, and we're seeing all the pieces kind of fall together. It's really fascinating.
Do you feel like he needed Bitcoin first as almost like his stepping stone towards this kind of co-opting the technology and the community towards getting in to be able to move towards this kind of tokenization? And let me just add into that: is this tokenization kind of a theoretical idea, or is it? Do you believe he actually wants to put assets on a specific blockchain?
Yeah, I think he does. I think there's a lot of reasons for that. For one, they're huge partners. Their authorized participant in the iShares ETF is JP Morgan Chase, as well as Jane Street, who are actually sourcing, the Bitcoin for this ETF. And JP Morgan, had one of the largest fines in U.S. history for, having their two of their lead traders spoofing treasuries markets, which are securities markets, and spoofing precious metal markets. These guys, were doing, these setting up dummy trades and basically manipulating the price of gold and silver, and then U.S. Treasuries of bonds. And so there's like an extreme history of these direct participants, literally in this system, that were using ETFs and using paper instruments as a way to manipulate the open market price discovery that's innate to a system like gold or like some sort of hard money. And now we're seeing Bitcoin being kind of shoved into that box of something where, Wall Street traders can use these funds, use these inflows, and use price mechanisms that should be free and open, and actually gamifying them to manipulate the price. And we saw, Jane Street Capital being where, kind of the breeding ground of where SBF came out of. Now we kind of know SBF and Alameda was using Tether to withhold the price of Bitcoin and try to keep it down, around $20,000, during that, 2022. We now know a lot about how people were trying to manipulate the price of Bitcoin using Wall Street mechanisms or dollar mechanisms. And so I think there's a reason why Fink is pushing towards Bitcoin being an asset, pushing this, hey, we're going to use the blockchain to quote unquote eliminate corruption, having a tokenized system. These are some of the biggest financial crime. I mean, the biggest financial crime in the U.S. history of all time was Bank of America, which is a former, large shareholder of BlackRock. And they got fined almost $17 billion for their participation in 2008. Where they misled regulators and didn't keep people's money safe. So we have JP Morgan, who got charged for spoofing markets, Bank of America, who got the biggest fine ever, and then we have Jane Street Capital. All of these people are directly connected to this Bitcoin spot ETF. As Fink is telling us, blockchain eliminates corruption. We're going to have a universal ledger. Everything's going to have a unique QSIP. You're going to have a digital ID system where you can use to purchase all of these things. I mean, they're really telling us where we're going. And yes, I do think that they want to use the power of blockchain, if you will, to tokenize these instruments, give them instant settlement, and then back it with an asset, like a USDC, which is directly connected with BlackRock. Once again, they were a huge partner in Circle's seed funding. There was $400 million raised by Circle, and BlackRock was one of the main participants in that. There's a lot of conflicts of interest here directly within BlackRock's S1 filing. They make note that stablecoins really affect the price of Bitcoin, and that Tether and USDCs in particular, their inflows and outflows are directly represented in the Bitcoin price. And here we have a direct conflict of interest with the issuer having a minority stake in one of the largest companies issuing stablecoins. So I think that they are absolutely moving towards tokenization very, very deliberately. And then, I think Whitney can kind of get into, I think, more of the green capital stuff and how that all fits in. But essentially, they need a ledger and a state to be able to uphold, these settlement mechanisms and to tokenize and fractionalize reserve assets and the natural world. And to create financial instruments out of the world, you need to have some sort of ledger and some sort of system to demarcate ownership. And to back it with an asset that gives it a value. So I think they need to use blockchain as a way to basically, encourage people to join this universal ledger with this universal ID. They sort of need to take advantage of what up to this point has really been a people's revolution, or at least marketed as such. And now we're really seeing it be, maybe this actually is a Wall Street play. These are the biggest participants in Wall Street, creating this web for us. Here we are. So yes, I do think quite literally they want to use blockchain. Mm-hmm.
And to quote you, Mark, because I'm going to quote you directly from the article. By the way, this is brilliant. You will allow BlackRock to build the panopticon of tokenized Earth TM with Americans' retirement money under the dialect pretext of owning the liberals, unknowingly collecting all aspects of ownership to centralized databases, walled identity gardens, and fractionalized reserve assets transmitted and issued on the private blockchains of Wall Street banks. The warring factions with the Davos socialites squabble over the spoils, but never against the plan. So what's quite interesting about this is not only have you identified the risk of allowing them to fractionalize all these assets, you're kind of almost pointing that they've kind of weaponized or they've co-opted the more right-leaning, conservative, or perhaps libertarian Bitcoiners into this end game.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think people are really cheering this on. People are getting up there and saying, "Hey, we're looking at the inflows and outflows of these ETFs. Bitcoin is going to $1 million before the halving." I think they're really, hoping for basically a number go up induced amnesia, basically of who these people are and how they've used these exact mechanisms just under different names. Tokenization of Bitcoin or the ETFing of Bitcoin is basically exactly the same as the paperization of the gold markets, right? And so we're cheering this on as if this is this freedom win, where in reality, there's a great argument to be made that Bitcoin has been co-opted and is being used as just another commodity, on a stock exchange for the likes of a BlackRock to manipulate and take advantage of. There's this big ism in the Bitcoin space that it's this freedom technology and it's for banking the unbanked and all these things, and it's such this unbelievable technology for financial sovereignty, which it is, of course, but also it's just that much so for these large institutions. And as much as it is helpful for you or me or Whitney or our friends or whoever, all of those same properties are still apparent for these large, $1 trillion asset holders and institutions, and they get to take advantage of those same things. Same with government, same with the U.S. regulatory system, the U.S. dollar system, So here we are, basically, at the start of 2024, and all of those same things that we laud and cheer on Bitcoin for are now also empowering, criminal entities and criminal, asset manipulators. So we have to just be very careful at, basically not allowing ourselves to be useful idiots. And basically cheer on the coming of this, as Whitney pointed out earlier. They're literally trying to create a new financial system. They're very out front about that, and here we are cheering it on as it's coming, this tokenized world. And Bitcoiners themselves are cheering it on because they know that it will make them a lot of money. And I think that's a very dangerous thing that we have to be very careful here. That this isn't just about making a bunch of dollars for a lot of us. This is about creating an ability to have censorship-resistant transactions and unseizable money. And the ETF kind of directly plays against that Bitcoin as a currency and really leans into it as a commodity. So yeah, I think we're being used a little bit and cheering on this co-option when maybe we should be a little more careful about that.
Whitney, do you want to add anything before I throw a question at you?
Yeah, sure. I would say, just look at how Larry Fink has been behaving over the past 2-ish years. He was known as a big ESG guy, right? And then he openly abandoned the ESG terminology and straight up said that climate finance, green finance, all of that stuff he's involved in is about profits, not about wokeness or saving the planet or whatever. And since then has also 180'd his stance on Bitcoin and has essentially changed a lot of his talking points, which I think is very notable because, Larry Fink, among other things, is on the board of trustees of the World Economic Forum. And I think the World Economic Forum is misunderstood by a lot of people, and people use certain terms to refer to what they are and what they do. But ultimately what that group is about advancing the public-private partnership model. And of course, there's two sides to that, much like there is in the prevailing left-right paradigm of most countries' politics. And for a long time, they've leaned sort of on the public side and used talking points that are meant to appeal to the political left, and have gotten a lot of pushback as a result. And so, if you notice, people like Fink, but other people as well, have moved their rhetoric away from those seeking to appeal to the political left in the public side of the public-private partnership, leaning into the private aspect of the public-private partnership and having more right-leaning talking points. But ultimately, all are trying to lead you to the same exact system of digital ID, programmable, surveillable money, and global carbon markets. And I think, the carbon market in particular, it's sort of hard to extricate that from the climate change, situation. But I think it looks like, people like Fink and some of the people in that particular space are going to attempt to market it as something that can make people very wealthy or allow them to get quick access to capital by tokenizing their land holdings and like fractionalizing their private property, using different things that haven't been able to be financialized before, and then bringing that on chain and using that as collateral, receiving loans that way, and all of that. There's a lot of ambitious plans in that particular space. And aside from that, there's been this push led by the Rockefeller Foundation and some other groups through this whole push for natural asset corporations, where they basically openly talk about the idea to expand the amount of assets in the existing financial system by like 5 or 6 fold by incorporating what they refer to as natural assets. So this is sort of like the financializing of the natural world, and turning, allowing people to sell ecosystem services and all of that. And, this is part of the broader effort to usher in a global carbon market. So anyway, I think it's interesting that there's a lot of this shift going on. I think it's a big part of why someone like Javier Milei was given the main stage at WEF and then openly praised by the WEF, that he was the WEF elites that he was supposedly scolding in that speech. They very much embraced, Milei's vision, and we're like, yeah, we should have the private sector lead the public-private partnerships and all of that. But ultimately, the public and the private, as represented within the WEF, agree about the plan. Maybe there's, how it's implemented or how it's sold to people. There's differences there, but ultimately they agree about where we're going in terms of like digital ID, a global ledger, and all of this stuff, programmable, surveillable money, whether it's private sector issued or central bank issued. Ultimately the end results are somewhat the same, but there's an effort to sort of change the sales pitch for all of that. And you can see it in Fink, and you can see it in other people.
Can I just quote this one? I think this might have been you this time, Whitney. Libertarianism, anarchism, and capitalism have become meaningless partisan buzzwords to guide the partially aware right towards promoting the corporate and corrupt capture of the public sector by the private. Hooray for the free markets, they cheer, as Milei places an ex-JPM Morgan and Deutsche Bank executive in charge of his central bank and reaches to outside finances to further dollarize Argentina. Was that you who wrote that section, Whitney?
That was actually Mark.
Oh, well, apologies. I attributed it to you. But that's the summary of what you were saying.
Yeah, more or less. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mark, sorry, you were going to jump in.
Well, just that I think, we've talked at length about a lot of this stuff. Maybe I literally wrote that, but, I think it comes downstream of a lot of, phone calls we've had kind of about this. And, I think, you really don't have to look too far at seeing the mismatch between the rhetoric and the action. And that's a huge part of, I think, of where the kind of political system is right now. You get a guy like Trump coming in who, in 2016 is, hey, I'm going to drain the swamp. I'm coming after you. I'm this anti-establishment, guru here that everyone hates and all this stuff. And then, what does he actually do? He locks down the country in total lockstep with, basically every other entity in the world. Every government basically did the same thing. He does Operation Warp Speed, pushes this, yada, yada, prints trillions of dollars, yada, yada, doesn't pardon Assange. In fact, actually has Mike Pompeo, murmur about assassinating him. They press charges. They don't pardon him. And now he's, they're basically rehabilitating him again as this anti-establishment guy to kind of come after, the Biden administration, who's supposedly this, big anti-Bitcoin administration, yada, yada. And then, you look at, Trump's tweeting about Bitcoin and about how it, it's not good and it challenges the dollar, yada, yada. Whereas his actual actions, he brings in Brian Brooks, the former VP, like kind of head legal guy at Coinbase, founding VP there to be the OCC, which is basically the head financial lawyer of the United States. And he passes legislation, basically that makes it legal for banks and these institutions to hold crypto assets, to hold Bitcoin, to hold stable coins and all this. So, the Trump administration, while maybe tweeting out things, actually was the most pro Bitcoin administration, we've seen. So this is a direct, 180 from the rhetoric as the action. You have Kushner in the White House, sending emails, referencing Sam Altman's blog post where he talks about creating a US dollar coin, a USDC stable coin, and how that might be helpful. You see a lot of this kind of, rhetoric on at the forefront, but the actions behind it being totally against it. Same thing with Jamie Dimon, right? At the beginning of December 2023, Jamie Dimon goes in front of the Senate and says, "I'm deeply opposed to crypto and Bitcoin. If I was the government, I'd close it down. It's for criminals, drug traffickers, money launderers, tax avoidance, not to mention all things that Jamie Dimon has more or less been, associated with." But hey, so he comes out, says all that stuff at the beginning of December. 2 weeks later, right before the ETFs are approved, he's announced as the authorized participant in the SEC filing for BlackShares, ETF, along with Jane Street, as we mentioned. And then, a couple months before that, in October, JP Morgan debuts the tokenized collateral network, the TCN. And they facilitate a transfer of tokenized money market funds from BlackRock to Barclays in this OTC derivatives trade. Right. So we see JP Morgan directly operating in blockchain. They have their private Onyx model, that's clearing, billions of dollars of volume, like $1 trillion of volume with their, basically private fork of Ethereum. And then working with BlackRock and doing this TCN trade while, 2 months later, Jamie Dimon is in front of the Senate saying, "Hey, it's for criminals. I hate it. I would shut it down." And then 2 weeks later, being the authorized participant to go source the Bitcoin. So there's just this huge rhetoric versus action mismatch in all of these players, right? And we know how important Jamie Dimon is and Larry Fink are to the public sector. In 2011, when they were debating the debt ceiling, after the large inflation that came from the stimulus to deal with the great financial crisis in 2011, then U.S. Secretary the treasurer there is calling Larry Fink 49 times, in the weeks leading up to that decision. The first person he calls after Ben Bernanke, after they come to an agreement, is Larry Fink. And then the second person he calls is Jamie Dimon. There's just so much collaboration that the line between the public and the private sector has completely blurred. It's really hard to tell who's really leading who here. And at the same time, they're going in front of mainstream media or even the Senate and saying one thing while then doing actions that are completely go against what they're saying. So there's this huge rhetoric action mismatch as these lines are getting blurred even further and further and further.
Yeah, interestingly, Mark, it points towards something that I've been quite confused about recently. There's this kind of blurring between what is, I think, libertarian principles and what are establishment conservative ideas. And I've kind of got myself in trouble with it a little bit recently. But for the libertarian principles of Bitcoin should be as far removed from the state as possible. Yet I've seen quite regularly people who historically, I've seen as principled libertarians cheerleading people I trust a little bit less. Elon Musk, Tucker Carlson, I got in trouble with this week, who has historically been a mainstream media mouthpiece of the conservative side of America. And this kind of blurring the lines it's kind of infiltrated this Bitcoin world, and there's people there who seem they seem to have got so upset with the left that they've kind of been co-opted into this right-leaning conservative talk points, but they seem far removed from libertarianism. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, 100%. I think we were trying to kind of get at that a bit at the article here, at least in the conclusion that, there's what's really the difference between these Davos, kind of Agenda 2030 or whatever, right? Like, what's really the difference between these things that, when considered part of the public space, it's considered socialism. These group, financial, basically, carbon markets being forced on the people, and how they're, everyone in the Bitcoin space, it's very obvious. They go, okay, yeah, hey, ESG is bad, carbon control is bad, oil, we need oil. This stuff is all bad. Let's reject it. But then when like someone that comes out who, calls liberals parasites and waves a chainsaw in the air and talks about how, socialists are the devil and all this stuff. And, they really rile up everybody with this rhetoric. But then they come in and they are bringing in these bankers who have basically straight up, said that, they want to use carbon markets and tokenize them and use them as basically a mechanism of control, and how we need to create this financial new system, in a dire way, because there's a climate emergency. There's a useful idiot sort of mechanism that's happening here. And what's really the difference? It's you hate these mechanisms when they're considered the public sector and they're considered from the state and they're considered socialist, but you love them when they're considered from the private model, and they're being looked at as this this free market. Hey, yeah, anybody should be able to use a blockchain to tokenize anything. Let's dollarize Argentina to own the liberals, right? Like, that's basically what's happening. People are cheering it on. I'm seeing a lot of anti-state people that have written like books about, how communists suck, and, anti-statists are now writing, basically love letters to Milei, and even though he's literally doing the same thing from an action standpoint. He's deregulating the government, taking away, the quote unquote public sector, but he's just handing it to the private. And again, I think this public-private paradigm is really important to consider, especially when it gets into, what the future financial system will look like. There's a lot of fear about CBDCs. But there's not a lot of fear about the private sector model creating private stable coins and private dollar instruments and private, euros. And people don't really seem to be concerned about, these large banks that should have lost our trust a long time ago, now getting into the, private capital via digital tokens. So there's a big rhetoric, Vivek and Trump are coming out and saying no CBDCs, Ron DeSantis, no CBDCs. And it's this easy win, but then you actually look at, well, what's the alternative then that they're pushing? And it's the private market. It's basically, the people that have been running the public sector for an incredibly long time anyway are now getting the rights for private capital under the new digital system. So I think there's a lot of danger in basically being dialectically pushed towards embracing the private sector, really just taking over the public sector. I don't even know if government issued CBDs can even really exist economically. They have to have a trusted third party to basically be account balances that settle. Whereas, a treasury or a piece of gold or even Bitcoin's UTXO model, it's not account balanced. It doesn't require a third party to settle. You can just hand them off to each other. And so it is M0. It is this base money. I don't think an account balance from a directly issued CBDC can even be base money. I don't think it's really possible economically. So the private model has to exist. It has to buy up treasuries, which is the base layer. That is the base money. That is the reserve asset of the world. It's U.S. treasuries. It's not the U.S. dollar. That's the currency of the world. And these treasuries are now being perpetuated and upheld and fractionalized and tokenized, by these huge private companies, by J.P. Morgan, by BNY Mellon, by the likes of Tether buying up, basically $100 billion of treasuries. So we're seeing the private market take private capital creation into the digital world. And I think we should be wary of that, as that rhetoric is basically manipulating us into trusting this private market.
If I can interject really quick and
Yep.
build off of what Mark was saying, I just want to sort of underscore the idea that there's a historical precedent, specifically in the US, for when they attempt to like pitch a particular policy or create a particular entity. If it gets pushed back as being openly part of the government, they privatize it and then no one complains. So a good example of this that I refer to a lot is the post 9/11 Dragnet surveillance operation that was going to be housed in DARPA, which is part of the US military, called Total Information Awareness. And then this was privatized by Peter Thiel and some other people and turned into Palantir. DARPA's LifeLog project, in the same vein, was privatized and turned into Facebook, again with the involvement of Peter Thiel. People on the left and right alike were extremely opposed to these programs when they were being run by the military, by DARPA, but then you go and turn them into a private sector entity that does essentially the same thing, or really does do the same thing, and it's embraced or treated as private sector innovation and what have you. And people, think because of the rhetoric that, oh, this is, everything's being handed back to the free market. But these companies, Palantir being an example, that was set up with state involvement, CIA involvement, right? So it's not really the free market, it's cronyism, it's crony capitalism, it's cartelism. And so with someone like Milei being like, yeah, I'm going to hand stuff off to the private sector, it's not like it's going to the Argentine private sector, it's going to foreign members of a global banking cartel that includes some of the biggest institutions on Wall Street that have a verifiable documented history of corruption, of trying to think of the best way to save this, basically enslaving countries like Argentina through the debt slavery model. BlackRock has been a big part of that. For Argentina, they hold a significant amount of Argentina's debt, and are one of these so-called vulture capitalist firms, which operate sort of as this cartel model, that are responsible in large part for Argentina's problems. And then Milei openly meets with him and is like, yeah, come visit Argentina and let's discuss investment opportunities. And think, according to Argentine media, is interested specifically in, buying up things that Milei plans to privatize, expanding the amount of essential Argentine infrastructure, which BlackRock already has significant stakes in, including in their power, their electric monopoly, Pampa Energia. And also, one of his Milei's top advisors, Dario Epstein, was referred to as BlackRock's man on the ground in the years before. Milei became a significant political figure in Argentine politics, and helped BlackRock get that stake in that power monopoly. And then he's given the central bank and also the economy to this duo that were in J.P. Morgan and then Deutsche Bank together. And were previously in the Mauricio Macri administration, where they oversaw a financial crisis. It's the same type of elite that Milei lampooned when he was on the campaign trail, but then he comes into office and becomes very Wall Street friendly. And the same thing happened with Trump as well, where, he campaigns against the neocons and the elite, and then he puts neocons like John Bolton in his office and gets very cozy with Wall Street, has a strategy and policy forum that's developing policies his administration enacts, and it's led by Steve Schwarzman of Blackstone Capital, Larry Fink's there, Jamie Dimon's there, all these Wall Street titans are there. The idea that these guys are actually populous when they're governing. I mean, obviously their rhetoric is very different, but as Mark pointed out, there's a big mismatch there. But this is stuff that this bait and switch really is something that's been used in a documented way over the past 20 years, and people are unfortunately falling for it once again. But it's important to point out that I think Mark would agree that in the context we're talking about it here, we're not necessarily referring to like free market capitalism so much as the crony capitalism that dominates, Wall Street and other, beds, nexuses of power like that.
Right. So you're basically saying Milei is being consistent with the principles of anarcho-capitalism by moving these into the private markets, but he's actually moving them to the worst people in the world that aren't truly free private markets. They're actually part of the kind of US crony system.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. Whitney, why do you think this happens? Why do you think this bait and switch happens? what happens to the likes of Trump? What happens to the likes of Milei that forces them to? Is there any sympathy given to Milei that perhaps to get where he had to form a coalition because he didn't have enough seats in parliament? So he had to form a coalition. There's some influence there. Is it to get things done? For his end goal, does he at short term feel like he has to work with the BlackRock?
Well, I think there's always certain ways people go about trying to justify why these leaders that have this particular mismatch we're pointing to here, why they do those things. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it does an extreme disservice to their campaign promises, which they end up not fulfilling in a meaningful way. So, if you take one of, for example, Trump's main campaign promises to drain the swamp, and he has like multiple swamp creatures running key aspects of his government. Sure, he maybe had to make deals, art of the deal guy, right? He had to make deals for particular things to get through. But, if you do too much of that, you don't end up delivering on anything. So I'm sure people can justify that. But in this particular case, I think outcomes matter a lot more than rhetoric, just because of where things are. And I think ultimately about why this is happening has to do with them trying to get people to voluntarily sign on or onboard themselves to these systems they're developing. And so if that's not going to happen successfully with like left-leaning talking points, and they're going to try talking points of the other variety to herd people into the same system, I don't think there's disagreement about the system. From people on the left or people on the right. There's a lot of things that have an extreme bipartisan consensus that are very bad for individual freedom and individual liberty in the U.S. in particular, and elsewhere as well. And, these guys ultimately agree over it. It's about the rhetoric that's being used to sell it. And it's important to keep in mind, too, that like the World Economic Forum this year and for the past several years post-COVID, the themes of their annual meetings have been framed around rebuilding trust. And so they know which group does not trust them, the group that's pushing back against ESG and these other talking points and initiatives that have been coming out of the WEF for several years. And now in order to rebuild trust, they're putting different figures, different people, and different talking points, in front of people and seeing if they'll be more accepting of the ultimate game plan if it's framed in different terms that appeal more to their values and their sensibilities, and also framed as opposing, particular figures that they don't like or they don't trust.
It's very interesting because as we head towards another election this year, which obviously will be a huge shit show, that this
yes,
there is if you escape the mainstream media that people hate so much, and I'm not a huge fan of US mainstream media, and what I would say is based in the UK. Not everything that comes out of the mainstream media is wrong, and not everything that comes out of independent media is right. I think you have to find a way to navigate them and find your own truths. But there is certainly this growing number of influential independent journalists, podcasters, who seem to be spending significant amount of time defending Trump, but it never feels completely objective and neutral. And from what you're saying is essentially they themselves have almost been gaslit into co-opting the same outcomes, which is things that are against liberty and freedom.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it too is just like a failure for people to really understand the left-right paradigm and how it works. One of the hands creates the problem, and the other hand comes in, the opposing side, then comes to power and is, on offering the solution to the problem the other hand created, but it's the same solution both sides agreed on the whole time, more often than not. I'll give you an example with Trump, the border wall. So that was like his big thing. I'm going to build a physical barrier. I'm going to build a physical wall. And then Democrats at that time said, no, our approach to border security is to build a smart wall. Yeah. Built on sensors and autonomous drones and towers, surveillance towers and all this stuff. And then by the time Trump leaves his first term, that's his position too. The wall we're going to build is a smart wall. We're not doing the physical barrier anymore. That was essentially his position in January 2019. And he and the Democrats are, in the same spot on border security. But somehow he's still seen as like the president that like plans to do the wall, even though in terms of rhetoric, he abandoned that and was going with the Silicon Valley approach of this company. The company that's building that smart wall has a bipartisan consensus. It's deeply tied to the CIA and has a lot of very troubling affiliations. And is developing like drones. There's the drones on the border, and then there's the drones made by the same company that are being used in Ukraine right now to kill people without human oversight and stuff. It's not really a great solution, I think. But it's not what Trump's base necessarily wants either, because all this infrastructure is set up on the border now. This smart wall is there, but is it really working? I mean, obviously not, because of the extreme situation on the border currently. And the solution being proposed by the Senate is to fund even more of these smart wall towers. And, this ultimately ties into the same goals of Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development agenda of having freedom of movement restricted and controlled through biometric means, all tied up with the whole digital ID thing and live facial recognition and all of this. That's what the smart wall implementation is really about, is having all ports of entry into the US being managed that way. And it's being rolled out simultaneously in places like the EU and Britain as well, and really throughout the world. And this is the particular way of selling it in the US. But both parties agree with it. And now, because of the frenzy over the border situation that's being fed, in a significant way by mainstream media, it's been bad for a long time, but the attention given to it has risen precipitously. And I think that's no mistake, because ultimately both parties agree that the solution is the smart wall. That doesn't work.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by how Ukraine would have played out if Trump had have won the previous election. If Russia had still invaded Ukraine, would the Republicans have also supported Zelensky and provided money and weapons of support? And if that had happened, would there have been bipartisan support, or would the Democrats have or the progressives been very anti-war, very anti-Zelensky? I'm fascinated by how that would have played out. And look, we can never know. But sure. It's always like every issue there's this line, and like half the country's on one side, half on the other, and it becomes this huge shit show, this big fight. And as we head into this, I mean, I'm just terrified of how this election is going to play out. I fully expect that there will be it'll end up in the courts, whatever happens, and there will be anger and disagreement and accusations flying around.
Sure.
And I worry about I worry that too many people are being co-opted into being pawns within this, rather than and standing back objectively and realizing that kind of old saying that it's two wings of the same bird. Hope that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people sort of forgot, something that Mark alluded to earlier, sort of the lockstep implementation of COVID policies globally, or the global agreements on things like Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals, and how that leads to sort of these globally coordinated, policies being implemented. And people saw that. A lot of people that saw that during the COVID era have seemingly forgotten that is a thing now, which I think is pretty disappointing. And again, the same divide and conquer left-right paradigm thing, I think, has been very effective. And it's, people have been really culturally primed for a lot of this. And also the idea that we need to wait for a political savior, I think, is a factor there too, that there's a lot of people, for example, in the States, that know something's very wrong and things have to change. And they think the only way to do it is to vote for the guy running in opposition to the current president is the only possible way to do that. And it's, frankly, I don't agree with that at all. I think that's part of the trap.
I think it's really interesting if you look at, a lot of us, really consider, okay, money is sort of the technological tool that they use to kind of create, debt and kind of create the serfdom, right? And you look at, the Purple Party bipartisan agreement on who gets to run the Federal Reserve. And if you go back to Volcker in the 70s, who was really kind of the king of interest rate manipulation, and you go all the way up into current times now with Jerome Powell, for these 50 years, every single Fed chair has been nominated by one political party and renominated by another. Every single one except Yellen, who was in there for only one term, who's now back as the Treasury Secretary. But every single one was nominated by one party and then renominated by the other, sometimes multiple times back and forth over Bush and Clinton, with like Greenspan and Bernanke. Like this is a clear-cut case where we can see, this is something that the economy is always a pivotal, talking point in incumbent versus opposition of political parties, and yet pretty much every single time since the mid 70s, there's been an agreement on who should run the Fed, even when there's a power regime change. So again, there's so much of this rhetoric is just face value and just flapping lips, and then the actual kind of quote unquote unelected officials that get placed in positions of power. This is really what that sort of quote unquote deep state is these unelected officials that get selected by the people that we elect. And you look at who actually gets to run those things. You look at something as large as the Federal Reserve, and there's a total purple party bipartisan agreement on who should do that. So I think that's just a really good point of where you can see where the rhetoric fails and where action actually speaks much louder than their words.
So what do we do? Because it feels like there's no way of breaking this, because we have this essentially a uniparty. We have it. It's it appears that we have this across the world. The first time we have somebody who appears to be somebody who wants to break this down, Millet, we now know he's co-opted as part of it. Like, what do we do? What do people do with this information? Help.
Well, I can say specifically just as a Bitcoiner, and then I'll definitely let Whitney go off on kind of bigger stuff. But I think from a Bitcoin standpoint, I think we really should reject this idea that Bitcoin only can scale basically via stable coins, and that Bitcoin is an asset and not a currency. And not before I get, big blockery and people accuse me of kind of wanting a block size increase or anything like that, because I don't. But I think that the idea that, as Fink says, that, I really don't see this as a currency, I see it as an asset. I think we really need to reject that and just make sure that, we realize Bitcoin is an invention. It's a technology, and it's something that, node policy and opcode, optimization can still be done, at an individual level and at a group level. And we perhaps need to focus more on making sure that Bitcoin is as accessible and permissionless as it was, when we found it. For some of us that have been in this space 6, 7, 8 years, 10 years, whatever, I think we really need to make sure that, when the next billion people come into this space, they're able to hold UTXOs and be self-sovereign and be able to transact without any issue of censorship or filtration or anything like that. And I think we really need to make sure that we don't basically help, Bitcoin become the tool that actually, is this universal ledger that enslaves us, and instead, push it towards being this tool of freedom and financial sovereignty, which it really should be. And there's, I think the Uniparty likes to use technology, via invert it with rhetoric and with, building off of those tools, like what I think Fink is doing with this ETF. I think he's very upfront about what he's trying to do. And I think we need to reject that as Bitcoiners and realize that, treasury-backed stable coins are not a scaling solution for Bitcoin. They are just an extension of the dollar system and an extension of the mechanism that funds the treasury system and the military-industrial complex and this empire that we are theoretically supposed to be fighting. So I would say as Bitcoiners, we should really push back on this rhetoric that it's just an asset or just a commodity, and rather embrace it as a currency. Even if that means, we need financial services to scale it. Let's build financial services that don't touch the treasury system, that don't perpetuate Cantor Fitzgeralds of the world, or the people holding, billions of dollars of treasuries that have been a part of this system that has taken advantage of, really the people of the US and of the world for, 50 to 100 years, depending on how long some of these banks have been around. So I think we really should reject that, and look to, other systems, eCash, federated, systems. We can build dollar instruments that don't touch the treasury system at all, don't perpetuate this Ponzi that really backs the US military and the dollarization of the world. We can create new systems using Bitcoin. And I really think that's where we should focus. But definitely want to let Whitney go off about other things. But I think really specifically, Bitcoiners should reject this notion, even though it's going to make us a bunch of money and ETFs and Bitcoin to $1 million and all this stuff. There's a real disconnect between the dollar's going to fail in 3 weeks and Bitcoin's going to $1 million. Hey, check out my implementation of Tether and my new wallet that I just built, right? It kind of doesn't make a lot of sense. So I think we need to push back against that. Again, I think there are good people that work at these companies that are building these things. There are good people that work at Lightning Labs and Blockstream, and these people working on basically creating dollar tokens that live on Bitcoin. There are good people that work there, but the outcome is what's important, not the intention. And I think the outcome is the dollarization of Bitcoin and a prevention of it being this censorship-resistant currency that we can all use. And I think we're getting basically led there via this promise of riches. And I think that that's a really dangerous way to go about it when we know damn well that this price will go up when the regulatory moat is finished being built. And the KYC, AML, and basically, the control mechanisms of surveillance that can go on top of Bitcoin and the banking system are built and finished. So we should just be really careful of that as we move forward here. I think this was going to basically be the most important year in Bitcoin, maybe since like 2013, since kind of like right after the first halving. I really think this will be really, really, really important, and Bitcoiners should really pay attention.
Over to you, Whitney.
Yeah. So, obviously there's a lot of problems to tackle. One thing that's been bothering me in particular is that I think independent media has become a big part of the problem in perpetuating it, because people have become just really through the realities of click metrics and things like that have sort of trying to, appeal to particular stuff in people's brains that isn't necessarily good, but generates clicks. And sort of becoming like a mainstream media light by, using like fear and anger and putting out things that like rile people up. There's especially in election season, I think we're going to see a lot of that. And traditionally that's come, from mainstream media, but it's definitely coming from independent media now as well. And I think that's problematic. I also think it's problematic that there's a lot of people in independent media that are funded by a lot of these intelligence linked oligarchs that are responsible for a lot of this crap. Peter Thiel, not to pick on him, but he's definitely funding a lot of, different prominent figures in independent media. I believe Tucker Carlson's new media company has some Thiel funding, for example, behind it. And I think people need to remember that when the WEF goes out and says they're rebuilding trust, and you look at that and you go, oh, well, there's no way I'm going to trust you guys. They're not necessarily talking about themselves. There's a deliberate effort to engineer consent and trust among the populace for these particular policies that they feel like they need to implement, that all national governments essentially agree about. Things like digital ID, programmable surveillable money, and all of that. And if a particular population, such as in the US, pushes against the public sector implementing that, like with CBDCs, for example, there's an obvious effort to try and sell what is functionally the same thing as a private sector entity. And there's really no discussion of that in the CBDC debate in independent media at all, of the threat of, JP Morgan and deposit tokens or tokenized deposits, which is definitely a thing that all the Wall Street banks, the big ones, are pushing into. The idea of a bank issued, stable coins and all of that as an alternative to the digital dollar, and things of that nature. All of that can be just as programmable and surveillable as a CBDC. So all of this rhetoric that we're against CBDCs seems to be, sort of to make people feel like they've won, in a sense, and that they're going to get something better for, freedom and financial freedom and sovereignty. But functionally, it's just as bad, if not worse, right? I think people need to keep in mind that there are intense efforts to psy-op people into buying into these systems. They want people complacent. They want people to feel like the opposition has won to these agendas, but really they agree about the plan at the end of the day. The type of implementation, maybe there's differences, slight differences, I would argue, but ultimately it's the same. And I think a lot of people think, oh yeah, after COVID or, after this event, like I'm awake, I get it. But really there are an unprecedented amount of just an insane amount of money has gone into manipulating how people perceive events. And with an effort to manufacture consent for these systems that are widely opposed in places like the US, specifically among conservatives and right-leaning people and libertarians, like the digital ID CBDC integrated system. They're looking for different ways to sell that to you. And people have to be very cognizant and aware of that, because I think if they're not, they'll be more susceptible. And I think there will definitely be an effort at some point to sort of lure those people in particular into a space of complacency, feeling like they've won, because of course in the US, those are the people that own the guns, right? And they definitely, in implementing systems that these people oppose, they want those people to be as compliant as possible. And the best way to do that is to make them think that they're winning.
Yeah.
So I think there's definitely going to be some hoodwinking there as this rhetoric sort of shifts to the right. But again, it's just like the left-right paradigm and the public-private paradigm that we discussed earlier. And I think people need to be really aware of that, as well as on social media as well, where just as an example, in the US, the US military has invested for over 10 years, millions and millions of dollars into social media manipulation techniques through bots and other means. And it would be very naive to think that now that Twitter X is under new ownership, that would be any different, because the person that owns that platform right now is a major contractor to the Pentagon. So to think that he would boot off, the Pentagon's mechanisms for manipulating public opinion, I think would be very naive, especially considering, Elon Musk's own links to other various parties, and also his willingness, or rather support for a lot of these policies that are also championed by people like Larry Fink and figures at the WEF, like the carbon tax, the carbon tokenized carbon economy, and all of this, the push for the everything app, and having your whole financial life be in a one app, one centralized app, and all of that stuff. I think people need to be more aware that there is an effort to manipulate opinion, and it's not all just going to be siloed on the left. There's definitive efforts to manipulate people on the right from the exact same actors. It's just they're using different figures and different talking points, but they're trying to lead us all to the same spot. So people need to really become critical thinkers again. I think independent media, to an extent, doesn't necessarily promote that, but they really should. You shouldn't just take people's words for things. You should look at the evidence. You should look at source links and articles and do your own research to an extent, and not just believe talking heads that are being promoted to you by the algorithm, whether it's the Twitter algorithm or the YouTube algorithm or Rumble or whatever. It ultimately comes down to being able to assess the information as objectively as you can and reach your own conclusion. And then ultimately, as far as how we get out of this, and the more broadly thing, I'll reiterate some of the stuff we talked about last time, Peter, which is the need for localization and decentralization. Mm-hmm. Building parallel systems, and not just in the financial sense, but really in all senses, so that if you are like me and you have a red line about joining the digital ID CBDC bank issued stablecoin thing, you can say no and build something or participate in a parallel system that does not engage with that. Because the more of us that resist onboarding to that system, the better off we'll be.
I'm so glad you brought up the point of independent media. And as somebody, I'm essentially part of the independent media, and you can feel the weight of it pull against you. That not only competing opinions yelling at you of what opinions you should hold, who you should interview, etc., but you're subject to essentially the same incentives as the mainstream media. Sure. In that awareness equals revenue. And mm-hmm. I've seen people. I used to be a huge fan of Tim Pool, and not just to target him, but I do always target him. I've seen someone who's changed and who I think has become co-opted by like one wing of American politics, and I can see that pull people in, and I've got in trouble over this last week. I don't know if you saw it, Whitney, but Mark probably saw it. Where I was the same about Tucker Carlson. I was perfectly aware that this is somebody who only became anti-establishment really at the point where he was fired by Fox News. His father is a lobbyist for Viktor Orban. He himself is a lobbyist. His stunt in Canada was paid for by special interest groups, and yet there are people champion right now the downfall of the mainstream media because his interview had 150 million views and it's completely independent. But it isn't completely independent. It is still subject to the same misaligned incentives. And I worry that people think this new independent media is suddenly their source of truth when it isn't always a source of truth.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, again, there's this effort to manufacture trust, and part of that is these new media figures that are very much promoted and put in front of people, and the algorithm favors extensively. Someone like Tucker Carlson, his father ran the U.S. Information Agency under Reagan, which was in charge of propaganda operations in favor of the arming the Contras in Nicaragua, aspects of Iran-Contra and its cover-up, all sorts of things that were going on during the Reagan era, particularly in Latin America, where the CIA was overseeing dirty wars and mass elimination of political dissidents by CIA-backed dictatorships. Tucker Carlson's dad was responsible for that. And then, young Tucker Carlson went and traveled to see the Contras, while his father was doing that, and had a very favorable opinion of them, among other things, and, has had a rather interesting trajectory within mainstream media itself. I believe before Fox, he was on MSNBC, very cozy with figures like Rachel Maddow, for example, and then sort of, has become the figure that he was at Fox and has since left Fox. And because of that firing, has this renewed or this rather newer anti-establishment credibility behind him. But I don't really see Tucker Carlson as someone who's necessarily anti-establishment, despite the fact that he's not at Fox. He's still very well funded. He has a new media company. I would consider or encourage people to interrogate some of his funding sources currently, and any potential conflicts of interest there. As far as the Putin interview goes, I think it's very interesting for a few reasons. One thing that was brought up by my friend Steve Poikinen is that the Assange extradition hearing is coming up, and that's a huge press freedom case. But now the fact that some figures on Twitter have called for sanctioning or other measures to be taken against Tucker Carlson for interviewing Putin, Tucker has sort of become the press freedom story of the month, as it were, as opposed to Assange's final extradition hearing. I think that's an interesting thing to note. And also, I think it's kind of odd that there was so much attention given to the fact that he was interviewing Putin. In the past, mainstream media figures have interviewed Osama bin Laden, Saddam Hussein, and all of these, U.S. adversary baddies. It's not something unusual, or it didn't used to be, maybe in the current state, but I don't really know how much of this rhetoric I necessarily buy as authentic, because, I'm paying attention right now in particular to this, what I would say is a manufactured effort to sort of, this phase shift, as Mark call it, sort of move the rhetoric from one side to the other, and sort of develop these figures that are trusted by the people, but ultimately, if they're not being used now, will be used in the future to sell you the same stuff at the end of the day. So I think it's important for people to be wary of independent media. Just because it's not on a mainstream media channel doesn't really mean it's truly independent. Funding of journalists and media organizations is important to an extent. And people also need to become critical thinkers again, and not make it about the person so much transmitting the information, but about the information itself, and engage with that information and critically think about what you think makes the most sense. I think in a world where journalism and media in particular has become so weaponized, it's incumbent on all of us to have some sort of media literacy and be journalists and researchers ourselves to some extent, if we actually want to know what's going on. And so I think people should definitely lean into that, really as much as possible, because we are really in an unprecedented time for psy-ops. I don't know how else how else to put it, there's an unprecedented amount of attention and money going behind getting people to onboard to all of these systems and this new financial system and these other things that they are setting up. And there's going to be a series of crises that are unleashed upon the world that are I'm sure, going to make it very difficult to resist, for most people, resist onboarding onto these systems as designed. And I think there's going to be all sorts of different ways they will attempt to get people to acquiesce to such a system. And again, I think people just need to be very cognizant that we are definitely in an age of information warfare. The goal is to manipulate and control as much as possible the public perception of reality and events. And it's going to be harder than ever to probably keep your head on straight about it. But the best way to do that is to, think critically about stuff and definitely pay attention to a person's actions just as much as their rhetoric, because, politicians in particular can say anything, but, very often they don't do what they say they're going to do. And then you end up in this sort of loop of voting for the lesser of two evils. And, oh, if you oppose that guy, you must support the other guy, sort of this binary thinking that people have been led into. And I think, again, because it's an election year, those parts of our brains are being triggered. And I think people need to resist that and be reminded of how things were last time Trump was in office, for example, and how really the oligarch class in the United States controls both sides of the political aisle. And we should be paying attention to what the bipartisan consensus is about these things, because that's likely what's to be enacted. And we have to focus on, what those things are and how to resist them when they are a major threat to, individual sovereignty and liberty, and specifically financial privacy and freedom.
Thank you, Whitney. Mark, I'm conscious we're probably drawing to a close here. Is there anything you want to finish off with, add on to this?
Yeah, a couple of things just right off the bat there. I think Whitney kind of finished on this left-right paradigm thing, and I think it was really interesting. I was, I lived, still do, but lived in the Bay Area in California during, COVID, basically, and I was pretty anti-lockdown and personally anti-vaccine mandates, certainly. And I was, basically considered a Trumper and lampooned as this like right-wing guy in this very liberal hotbed for feeling one way, which was something I always had to kind of reject. I'm like, no, I'm neither. I'm neither of these things. And now I'm kind of coming out as I'm sort of pointing out this phase shift as Trump is coming in and being lauded as being this, pro-freedom, anti-establishment guy again, being rehabilitated. And I'm calling him out again for, hey, well, he did Operation Warp Speed. He locked down the country. He printed trillions. And now people on Twitter are calling me a triggered Biden voter. And it's like, what happened? No, I'm not that at all either. Neither. So I think that's really interesting, is noticing when that shift has happened. And I've noticed it just in rhetoric back. I haven't changed my opinion or my rhetoric on these guys in years, but people's association based on what I say, which I think I've been relatively consistent, I'm now in a different camp because the phase shift of public perception has switched. I also think it's interesting, we understand, basically Operation Mockingbird operating, that there is actual psychological operations via the media that's done on U.S. citizens and the world, via intelligence agents, right? And I think it's interesting that the medium has changed so much just in my lifetime. Clinton was basically this daytime TV guy. He's coming out on Arsenio and playing saxophone and, getting manufacturing consent that way. Bush comes out and he's kind of more the movie, Black Hawk Down, kind of these video games like Call of Duty, kind of getting this consent for, the war on terror. Then Obama kind of comes out and he's kind of the internet president, and he's kind of Reddit and internet based. And then Trump is like the Twitter president and maybe a little bit of YouTube and that, that forum. And now we have kind of guys like Malay who are like the TikTok guys, right? And they're coming out doing these very TikTokable talking points and quotes where he's ripping off, departments of his government that he wants to privatize and yelling afuera, afuera. And he's got his chainsaw and calling the liberals parasitos. And, he's basically the president from Idiocracy, just instead of a machine gun, he's got a chainsaw. And so the medium that they use basically to manipulate consent and to push certain rhetoric is also the same mechanism and framework that they themselves are also stuck in and they have to operate in. So I think by being aware of the medium that's being used to basically for these operations to be enacted, we can kind of push back in their own frameworks. So that's why I think it's really important for independent media to basically understand sourcing, understand how rhetoric versus action works, and how manufacturing consent works. And we can basically use the same tools that are basically used to try to enslave us in ideas to push back against those very ideas. So we actually have a lot of power right now with the internet being relatively open, that we can get together and have discussions like this, or like, dissonant folks that feel a lot of these similar ways, like myself, meeting, the journalist Whitney Webb online and being able to work together and do this stuff. It's like there is a lot of power still in the open internet. And we should really take advantage of it to make these kind of landmark collections of tropes and of financial entities being connected, and really put together this web of how these operations work. And I think, we can kind of use this framework to push back. So I think there is a lot of hope, despite it feeling really scary a lot of the times, or that, we've already lost or anything like that. Like, I really don't think that's true. There's a lot of desperation being shown as well. The phase shift is a really important thing to note because the cycles of the phase shift are compressing. So whereas I think these bigger phase shifts used to take a decade or half a decade, they're now happening in a 2.5-year period, or 18 months or 6 months. And so as the cycles compress, it's harder to forget. We can work on our short-term memory and remember these things, and remember that, okay, we're cycling back to the same thing that we saw under Trump in 2016, the same thing that we saw after 9/11 in the 2000s. We're seeing this shift back to right-wing, talking points in order to perpetuate the same plan that is this purple party plan. So I think there's a lot of hope in there that, more people are waking up to this. It's more just about creating incentive structures and architecture within the media system, within the information war space, to create sustainable, immutable data points, and so that people can refer back to them, and the past can't be as manipulated. Because as we know, Orwell's dictum, who controls the past controls the future. So if we can really remember the past together and work together in our own specific fields to really put this picture out there of this, this coalition that's working against the freedom of the human race, we'll have a much easier time getting people on our side. And that's really what they fear is a true populist uprising. So they're inverting and co-opting populist uprisings. That's what they do. Mm-hmm. That's what they did with the Dalai Lama being a paid CIA asset. That's what they did with the hippies in San Francisco in the late 60s and co-opting it into this CIA MK Ultra thing. Like, it always starts with a real, true human revolution that then gets co-opted. And I think Bitcoin is not any different. And we have to just be very careful about the co-option of Bitcoin and the true freedom and self-sovereignty movement that was birthed with Bitcoin and with the community, and make sure that doesn't get lost.
Thank you. That was brilliant, Mark. What a brilliant way to end it. Do you have any closing comments, Whitney?
No, I would definitely just definitely support what Mark said. People just need to be really aware of, there's efforts to manipulate everything going on. And I think particularly in the Bitcoin space, people need to decide if it's going to be something that they want to let be co-opted by Wall Street, or if people in the Bitcoin space want to fight for it to be the tool it was originally marketed and sold to people as a tool for, sovereignty and financial freedom. Because if it ceases to become that and becomes like the chief means of asset storage for BlackRock and associated institutions, for them to, usher in this new global financial governance system and financial system that they want to impose on everybody. I mean, what does that mean for the values that supposedly underpin Bitcoin in the first place? And, what are we doing here, and what are we supporting? These questions need to be asked. And I think it's very important that, people that want to oppose the Wall Streetization, I guess, of of Bitcoin sort of look at how what can be done to allow its functionality as a currency for that to be able to scale and sort of avoid the efforts to sort of make it only a commodity in the hands of the same people on Wall Street that manipulate the prices of all other commodities for their benefit. I mean, do we really want to let Bitcoin become one of those heavily manipulated commodities that serve the Wall Street bankers, especially when Bitcoin was created as a way to hedge against irresponsible monetary policy and Wall Street corruption? I think we're at a stage where it's very important to ask ourselves what we're doing and to take a stand accordingly.
Okay. All right. A lot to take in here. Also, my father sat in the other room. I think he's going to have some questions for me about this afterwards, which will be fascinating. Whitney, I mean, this is the second time we're recording in a couple of months, and it's just both times have been absolutely fascinating. And Mark, I'm a huge fan of yours, and it's been good to hear from you as well. And the two of you working together is just fascinating. So, look, I appreciate you both going on. We will push this and your previous article out to everyone when we release the show, and hopefully draw a lot of attention to this. And I do hope we draw more broader skepticism rather than just the skepticism that suits your ideology. So I appreciate you both. Thank you so much for joining the show. And one day at some point, Whitney, we will do this in person. I've had Mark over here in Bedford where I live, flew all the way once. But I think I'll come to you at some point. But thank you both. Appreciate the work you both do.
Yeah, thanks. Pleasure to be back.
Thanks so much, Peter. Appreciate it.